Hi, thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining the Apologist bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. I just got finished reading a new book by Lee Strobel. I say new book, 2021, so it's pretty new. It's called The Case for Heaven. And of course, he's got a series of these case for books. First one started the whole thing going was The Case for Christ. I like that one a lot. I like his second one, The Case for Faith. I think that's wonderful. I've used that in our apologetics class. And like I said, a whole lot of others. Well, this one has some really powerful names that are giving it a thumbs up. J.P. Moreland, J. Warner Wallace, Sharon Dirks, Doug Groothuis, Roma Downey, who's an Emmy-nominated actress, producer, and a best-selling author, John Stonestreet of the Colson Center, and on, Paul Copan. So people really like this book. It's called The Case for Heaven, trying to make a case for life after death, and what kind of life would it be? So I'm going to take chapter, let's see if I get the title of it here. Chapter 9, it's called The Reincarnation Sensation. I like that title. What if life is cyclical? And we're hearing that a lot. In fact, I'm talking to a person online. We're going back and forth, and I think he believes in reincarnation. He's a little fuzzy about it, but anyway, I think he believes in reincarnation. So it's a big deal. And so Lee Strobel says, I need to talk to somebody about this. And he decides the person he wants to go to, and I think he made a good choice, is Doug Groothuis. Groothuis, Groothuis. And the reason why he wanted to go to him is that he's probably one of the first Christian philosophers, modern Christian philosophers, to do a lengthy critique of Eastern religions and the New Age movement. In fact, his book was called Unmasking the New Age. That came out in the 80s. And Confronting the New Age. And they followed up with a third one, Revealing the New Age Jesus. So these are in the 80s up to about 90 or 91. So it's interesting because as he sits down, you know how Strobel does his books. He sits down with somebody and throws the questions out there. So he said, he kind of stunned Lee Strobel. He said, I used to believe in reincarnation myself. And so at college, he learned about Hinduism and Buddhism. He read stuff about the occult and paranormal, and so he bought into it. But he became a Christian, and he realized that the teachings of Jesus were simply incompatible with Eastern religion. So he kept going back and taking a look at them. So he's done a lot of work. And he says these ideas are not supported by the evidence. So Lee says, well, do you see why ideas like reincarnation capture so many Americans? He says, oh, sure. It's a romantic sense of adventure. Hey, how about that? You know, you've lived before, you might live again. Who knows what kind of escapades you could have? And he gives an example of Shirley MacLaine, and she'd been a teacher on the island of Atlantis before it sank. How cool was that? She was decapitated by Louis XV. That's great stuff. But Groothuis says, you know, that's completely a non-Hindu approach to reincarnation. The classic teaching is that you don't want to be reincarnated. You want to stop that and attain enlightenment. You don't want to come back. This is a wheel of suffering on life, round and round and round. And how do you get off it? Through the law of karma. It's kind of a moral cause and effect. Eventually, you want to get off that wheel of karma by becoming enlightened. And he says, you know, Americans look at this karma idea is an infinite way to get better from lifetime to lifetime. Americans are always big on that, right? We're always trying to figure out how to be better people, how to make more money, how to win friends, et cetera, et cetera. So he says, you know, Americans import from Christianity the idea that life is worth living and it's adventure. But he said, no. The Hindu or Buddhist view of life is disease, it's decay, it's disappointment, it's injustice. And Lee says, well, many Americans kind of think of your goal as nirvana, kind of like heaven. And Doug sets them straight. He says, there's no heaven involved. Nirvana is like, he says, some people call it what's left when you blow out a candle. It's an extinguishing of the self. There's no person. There's no individual. There's no relationship. We're just to be snuffed out, to have no desire. He said, wow, contrast that with heaven. That's a place where you get restored relationships. It's pure love. You're going to be with God who's love, open fellowship, a restored creation. We will care about each other. He said, you don't have anything like this in Buddhism and Hinduism. It's just oblivion. All right, so let's take a look at some of the things that Lee is going to throw at him, some of the questions. He says, here's one person who's a British physicist. He says the idea of reincarnation presents no logical difficulties. And Groothuis says, oh, really? He said it has a whole raft of philosophical obstacles. So here's one. If reincarnation and karma are true, then you'd have to have individual personal selves that can continue and come back in another life and continue in another life and so on. He said, well, that's a problem for Buddhism and some Hinduism beliefs. They don't believe in the existence of an individual personal self. So they can't support this idea of a self that goes on lifetime after lifetime. So without a soul, you don't get reincarnated. So he says these religions are logically inconsistent. You can't put reincarnation with this. It says they must be false. He said then you got the problem of the standard teaching that you're reincarnated an infinite number of times in the past. Hinduism says there's no beginning to the universe. It's cyclical and it just goes on and on and on. But he said, think about this. You can't traverse an actual past infinite. You can't do it. It's like trying to debate when the origin of the universe came about. It's got to start sometime. If you're in an infinite past, he says it's like jumping out of a bottomless pit. You never get to now. And yet we're here. So the idea of an infinite number of past lives is just logically incoherent. I thought that was a good point. Now think about that one. If that didn't strike you immediately, you can't count up to infinity, right? So he also says, let's take a look at karma. He says the people who follow it say it's like a scientific law. He said, Groothuis says, well, karma isn't like the law of gravity. That's an impersonal law of nature. That's just the way the universe works. It doesn't make any decisions. But with karma, you're talking about a moral law. That's very different. Now, what's a moral law? It's something that's based on moral judgments. So if you're going to talk about rewards and punishments, you have to have an evaluator. You got to have an administrator. Somebody has to listen to the evidence and say, this is what I decide. But he said, if that's true, if karma is true, that's an incredibly complicated system. It has to be implemented. How do you implement this unless there's a mind or an entity behind it? Here's another problem that Groothuis brings up. We don't remember our past lives. How fair is that, he says, if we're being punished for something that we can't recollect? How are we going to get better if you can't figure out what you did wrong previous to that? He says that seems dysfunctional. He said the other thing that seems really bad about it, karma says there's no unjust suffering. Everybody gets what he or she deserves. He said, think about little innocent children who suffer. Really? So they've done something evil in a previous existence and they fully deserve to suffer in this lifetime? That seems terrible. He says, in addition, Groothuis brings up one more point. Maybe we shouldn't try to help people who are suffering. Why would you alleviate pain? Why would you get rid of poverty? The people that are suffering, the people that are poor, the people that are struggling, they're getting what they deserve. In fact, Groothuis says it'd be wrong to help them. They got to pay off their bad karma. If you step in and help them, you're just creating lengthier stays in this bad world for them. So he says the notion of karma is just insupportable. It's irrational and false. So at that point, Lee Strobel brings up an old book, came out in 1956, called The Search for Bridey Murphy. And he said, well, listen, Doug, if reincarnation is inconsistent, what do you do about the evidence that the proponents cite in its favor? And he uses this book. The book influenced a lot of people. In fact, he says even today, it's influencing people toward reincarnation. So Groothuis says, we got to look deeper at it. He said that when the case was thoroughly investigated, all the evidence could be explained away without reincarnation. So what's the story? Well, there was this woman said she was born as Bridey Murphy back in the late 1700s in Ireland. And she died on a Sunday in 1864 in Belfast. But local records don't support the claims. They don't list the family name. There's no will. The husband was supposed to be a lawyer. No information from that. No obituary. She recalled a wedding ceremony she said she was part of at a St. Teresa's church. There's no church at that time. She said she lived with her husband on Dooley Street. There was no such street. And it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. Life magazine, in fact, looked at all the data and said there was nothing in her story that couldn't be explained either on coincidence or subconscious memory of some overheard conversations. So that seems to the balloon has deflated there. The fact even the woman herself, about 20 years later after the book came out and there's a big deal made about it, she said her hypnotic regression hasn't even made her a firm believer in past lives. Wow. So then Strobel asks Groothuis, could you elaborate why you distrust hypnosis to give us information about previous lives? Because that's what a lot of people depend on. They say, yeah, I was under hypnosis and he took me back to a previous life. But he said, Groothuis is saying, well, the subconscious doesn't piece everything together. It's scrambled with bits of things that we've seen and experienced. So he said, maybe a person saw a film on ancient Egypt, and when the hypnosis probes, the person thinks of Cleopatra and starts thinking, hey, I was Cleopatra. Scientists, he points out, have long known that hypnosis subjects are suggestible, very suggestible, and they tell the hypnotist what they think they want to hear. I mean, after all, with the hypnotist, how do they start? They say, you will go back before you birth to another time and place. So the subject says, okay, I'll try to do that. A couple of psychologists writing in Science magazine says, during hypnosis, you are creating memories. You're not discovering them or uncovering them, you're creating them. So Groothuis says, I'm really skeptical about this. He said, especially because of cryptomnesia. See if I can say that. He says sometimes called cryptoamnesia. He says a person oftentimes can take in information and then forgets the source of it. Then later recalls the information but thinks it's from a past life because he can't remember where it came from. So he says that's happened a lot. And so he doesn't buy into that as well. So Groothuis said there are other explanations that we can give for these past lives. He said kids have creative imaginations. You got child prodigies that are just simply geniuses ahead of their time. You don't have to invoke this elaborate doctrine of reincarnation to explain some kind of a natural explanation. What about deja vu? He said, a person comes into a village, never visited, and feels like he's been there before. Really? Is that because he led a prior life? He said, that's a big stretch. What if he just had a dream about a similar location or saw a scene like that in a movie or TV show that he had forgotten? And then Lee Strobel says, well, what about xenoglossy, where people can speak in languages that they never studied? That's pretty hard to dismiss those. But Groothuis says, well, you can explain those. Maybe the person was exposed through television or conversations and they just subconsciously picked it up. So Lee really pushes him. He said, yeah, but there are some cases that are really difficult to explain, right? And Groothuis says, yes. And he said, there may even be other possibilities. How about demonic influence or possession? He said, you look at the Bible and it says those kinds of things can happen. And the whole idea of reincarnation is to pull people away from the Christian gospel. So there'd be a motivation for dark forces to do that. And Lee Strobel mentions philosopher Gary Habermas. I love the material Habermas puts out, especially on the resurrection. But Habermas reported there was a case of a novelist who said she'd been reincarnated more than a dozen times. Well, later they found out that she'd been provided all sorts of historical details through her personal link to a spirit. So Habermas says this suggests that the so-called evidences for reincarnation could be coming from deceptive, non-human spirit beings. Groothuis also said there's just some outright fraud that goes on as well. And finally, toward the end of this interaction with Strobel, he says, let's keep something in mind. So Groothuis says, we have powerful and persuasive evidence that Christianity is true. If Jesus really is the Son of God who died for our sins, then what he says about the afterlife, that's the most credible of all. And the Bible talks about resurrection, not reincarnation. He said you'd need a lot more concrete evidence about reincarnation to overturn all of that. He said, frankly, it's just not there. So I think that's really powerful. Again, the book is The Case for Heaven. I firmly believe if you read that book, it's going to leave you in tears in some places. It's going to have your heart melt. You'll be excited. The idea that there is a heaven and it awaits us, that this life is not all there is. And thank God for that and amen to that. Well, thanks for listening. We'll do another podcast soon.